The MEAC preseason polls were highly anticipated, and they did not disappoint because they revealed one thing is crystal clear. After the top two, there's a huge separation. Oh, yeah, it's locked on HBCU. Play my music.
You are Locked On HBCU, your daily podcast covering HBCU sports. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, family? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On HBCU podcast, your number one daily one-stop shop for everything HBCU athletics, Monday through Friday. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I, of course, am Darrion Gray, a.k.a. the Mouth of the South, Texas Southern alum and former TSU Herald sports editor and current site expert at Who Dat Dish and contributing writer at USA Today's Saints Wire. Thank you for going on this journey with me, making Locked On HBCU your first listen of the day every day. And remember, just because the mic cuts off does not mean that the journey is over. Just means it's time to follow me on Twitter at South Exclusive. Starts with an S and ends with an S. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Now, new customers can go to Gametime, download the app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. We'll wrap up today's episode with a look at Texas Southern, who many many SWAC coaches believe is flying under the radar. In segment 2, we'll take a look at why there's something different about Morgan State. They're not predicted to win the MEAC, but they are a more competent team preseason than I've heard them be talked about in a long time. Now, segment 1 is about the two teams who are projected to be at the top of the conference, the two teams who are projected to war it out for the MEAC title. And let's be crystal clear, there are only two teams that are actually expected to be championship contenders. When you have polls, you have to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? If I'm talking to you, I can say this is 1, this is 2. There's a big gap, then there's 3, but you can't really do that on print. It's very difficult to accomplish that. But the way that the Mid-Eastern Athletic Conference really drove the point home is by having the points. Now, this happens on all conferences. You're going to have a point system because they want you to know how we got to these rankings. In every single conference, you're going to have votes. It's going to be player personnel, coaches. It's going to be people connected, right? You're going to see the point totals of how many points they accumulated, and you get more points for a first place, then second place, then third, all right, so on and so forth. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. But when you look at the point system, and not just the number that's to the left, but the numbers to the right, right? South Carolina State had 63 points. They have 5 first-place votes, right? The number to the left is just your seeding. The numbers to the right are your first-place votes and your total points. Just so that part isn't clear. But let me say that. South Carolina State had 63 points and 5 first-place votes. North Carolina Central had 61 points and 4 first-place votes. Now you have Morgan State, who is third, technically right behind Central and South Carolina State. Morgan State had 39 points. That's a huge drop-off. You're going from 63 to 61. That's thin, right? That's paper thin. But then you go down to 39, and we see that there is a clear separation between 2 and 3. You go from 3 to 4, Norfolk State has 36. Howard has 33. Delaware State has 20. So I'm going to get to that Delaware State part at the tail end of this segment. But one thing you see is that there's 2 teams at the top, and then there's everybody else. Nobody else got more than 1 first-place vote, and this is what I was looking for. I didn't expect third place, fourth place to be getting 2 votes. I didn't expect that as far as 2 first-place votes. I didn't expect that. I expected to see it be top-heavy, and that's what we got. I think that it is marked by unpredictability still, but this is still consistency from the conference because they expect the standings to end the same way that they ended in 2024, right? So that's actually really interesting. Is going into MEAC Media Day, I talked about how the conference was marked with unpredictability. And then coming out of going into MEAC Media Day, I talked about how the conference was marked with unpredictability. And then walking out of MEAC Media Day, you see it's just everything's going to be the same. That's not predictability necessarily. I don't think it is, but it is a funny kind of back and forth of yesterday versus today. But I still think that this is a very unpredictable conference because the unpredictability comes at the top. It's the fact that it's really anybody's conference. No, it's really Central or South Carolina State's conference. That's what it is. It's okay, what happens? So now all eyes are on North Carolina Central versus South Carolina State. That's how it should be. That's what it will be. The conference has been a two-team conference since they shrunk. It's really been a two-team conference a few years before that too. But one thing that's really interesting to me, one thing that really piqued my interest is that South Carolina State is on top, but they do not have the star-studded roster that the MEAC believes North Carolina Central has. Now, if you remember last year, they had stars on top of stars. I'm talking Broughton, Hall, High, Smith Brown, Carter, Phoenix. They had stars, Washington, Smith. They had all kinds of stars at South Carolina State. I don't remember what the preseason all MEAC team had, but you go back to after the season was over, everybody knew how talented that South Carolina State is. Now you go into 2025 and the prediction is that North Carolina Central is going to have all the stars. I know Trey Oliver said we don't have any stars. Not according to this. Walker Harris, Luke Bracey, Noah McKinney, Trayvon Humphrey, AC McMoore. Those are all first team, all MEAC offensive players. Max Urin, Malcolm Reed, Jelani Vassell. Those are all first team, all defensive players. Chance Peterson, a wide receiver, first team or second team, all offense. Then you have Christian Smith and Caleb Robinson, not with an N, but a Robinson, who is a place kicker. And then you have Smith, who's a defensive lineman. So when you go through the all-conference team, it's a whole lot of North Carolina Central. So they're star-studded. That's what makes the top of the conference so interesting, is that Trey Oliver, fantastic coach. Chennis Berry, fantastic coach. North Carolina Central has this star-studded roster, filled out pretty much the majority of the first team all offense, yet you have South Carolina State who's on top. 63-61. Really, that first place vote makes a difference. One got 5, one got 4, and that's how you have the Bulldogs on top. Razor thin. You're talking about paper. You remember that time when the referee had to get an index card that goes through and to see if it was a first down? That's how close that the MEAC conference or the MEAC race is. But yeah, this is big, guys. I think that South Carolina State will be driven by their defense. They only had 2 players or 3 players in the entirety of the all MEAC team, first or second. And 2 of those guys were defensive players. They brought 2 defensive players to MEAC Media Day. The defense will set the tone for this team. That's my expectation. But it's interesting, guys. Walking into this event, I'm predicting a lot of unpredictability, and I still feel that way going into the season. But the MEAC thinks everything is going to be the same. First, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. There's not going to be anybody who changes places, and it's going to be Orangeburg versus Durham for who's going to win. It's South Carolina State versus North Carolina Central. Who's going to win this conference? Now, also, one thing that you note is when you're looking at the MEAC, they're telling you that South Carolina State, North Carolina Central, and then everybody else, kind of. Because it's South Carolina State, North Carolina Central, big gap, 3, 4, 5, big gap 6. There's no respect for what Deshaun Jackson is bringing to Delaware State. The expectations have not elevated. The expectation is not for them to go from worst to first. It's not even to go from worst to middle of the pack. Matter of fact, the MEAC, the voters here, they felt comfortable saying Delaware State is easily the worst team in the Mid-Eastern Athletic Conference. We talked about the Vic effect. We talked about the Jackson effect. You can't necessarily see it through the preseason polls, but it makes me even more excited to see what we get coming into the regular season. They don't think it's going to make much of a difference, though. I'll tell you that. Now, as you push forward, we're going to take a look at Morgan State, the third place team, but there's something different. There's something different. They're a more competent, more complete team going into 2025 than I've heard them be talked about really since I've started this show. Let's get into that as we continue with Locked On HBCU. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Maybe I want to go get some Saints tickets, right? Maybe I want to go watch my boys on the road or at home. Maybe I want to go out to Atlanta for a game. Maybe go to New Orleans for a game. Where's somewhere else they play? Regardless, I can go out there and I have time. And if I'm new, which you may be, if you're in my shoes, you may be a new person to Gametime. Well, go ahead and download that app as I'm talking. And you can get $20 off your first purchase when you use the code Locked On College. If you're new. If you are new to Gametime, it's simple, but maybe you want to go to your favorite team. You may not be a Saints fan. You may just want to go to, matter of fact, you might want to go to a North Carolina Central versus South Carolina State game. Makes sense. Looks like the MEAC championship right now have a front row seat via Gametime. It's simple. If there's tickets to go to the event, they can be found on Gametime. If there's tickets to go to an event, the best price is on Gametime. If there's tickets to go to an event, go to Gametime. Download the app, create an account, and get that $20 off if it's your first purchase. As we continue rolling on today's episode of Locked On HBCU, I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day every day. For your second listen, make sure you're checking out Locked On Saints. We unveiled some new jerseys yesterday. That's why I got on my gold today. They say what's gold is new again. So if you want to cop one of these, go get you one. I'm ready for the season already. So I had to throw on my jersey. Anyway, I just wanted to flex my team, flex my guy Ross's show. Y'all go check that out. Fantastic content. We're getting into football season. So we talked about how there's a separation between first place, second place, and everybody else. I kind of want to say they're confident that Morgan State's going to be third because they're ahead of everybody despite not getting any first place votes. Now, when unveiling the poll, Jay Walker said those first place votes for Delaware State, Norfolk State, and Howard are self votes. Now, I never thought about the idea that, yeah, of course you're just going to vote for yourself, but Morgan State didn't do that. If Morgan State wanted to vote themselves first place, I don't think that that's a lack of belief that they didn't. But if they wanted to, the gap probably would have been a little bit bigger between them and who's right after them, Norfolk State, right? It was only 3 points. It could have been a little bit bigger of a gap, if we're going to be honest. But they didn't do that, and it was close. But what's different about Morgan State going into 2025 is I know when you call a team more competent, it feels like such an insult, and maybe it is. It's not intended to be, though. Complete is probably the better word to articulate how the change in tone around Morgan State should be received. Think about, I've been doing this show since 2021. Yeah, I have been doing this show since 2021. I don't remember the last time anybody has spoken about or led with the Morgan State offense in a positive tone. Think about that. I'm going on 4 years of doing this show, and this feels like the first time ever that someone has led with Morgan State's offense and done it with a positive tone. I've heard people lead with the offense before because they feel so confident in the defense. I've heard people say, hey, this offense has to be good. They can't keep wasting this defense. I've heard people say, you know, if the offense ever gets it together, Morgan State is going to be a real force in the MEAC. I've heard those things, but that's not what I'm hearing this year. Instead of hearing if the offense can, if the offense would, if the offense finally, instead of hearing ifs, it feels like there's a concrete feeling that the offense actually got it together. For crying out loud, they got the offensive player of the year in Jason Collins, excuse me. And that's one of the weirdest offensive players of the year that you'll ever see preseason wise, because he made second team. Actually, if that ever happens postseason, which I don't think you would, I think that's only going to happen in the preseason. But if it ever happened in the postseason, it'd be strange too. But Jason Collins was voted a second team All-MEAC running back, and then he was voted the player of the year. I thought the same people did these. So that was interesting to me. That being said, outside of the strangeness around the vote, he's a talented player. He's a very talented player, and I like Jason Collins. I think that I want to see what he can do more in the passing game because of his size. I know you stereotype players who are of certain build, but that's just how it goes, right? You're 185 pounds. I want to see you be able to catch the football. And he's shown that ability, but it's not asked of him a lot. He did it against Howard in the season finale, so I know it's there, but like I said, it just isn't something that they require from him. I want to see if they ask him to be more of a carry the football down in, down out guy. He actually didn't even have the most carries on Morgan State's team last year, but he had 8 touchdowns. I think that he's going to take over from Miles Marie, who's going to be who's no longer with the team. So now, naturally, you would think he's going to get a higher workload. That's something that'll be interesting. We can have conversations around second team all MEAC and then be voted offensive player of the year, but we're here now. What is Jason Collins' ceiling? It'll be interesting if they use him in more of a run heavy capacity, or they say he's a smaller framed guy. We want to use him with another running back who's a little bit bigger, maybe use him out of the backfield as a receiver more. I'm just stereotyping because he is 185 pounds. So you naturally want to see how they use players like him. But if he's anything close to an offensive player of the year, they're going to be right about Morgan State being much different than they are. I'm talking about Daniel Casillas, excuse me. I hate when people say Silas. But Daniel Casillas, then I did it again. Casillas, he's talking about they have the best quarterback room in the conference. And he didn't say that on camera. He walked up to Tiffany and Jay after or before the interview and said, we have the best quarterback room in the conference. You ask Damon Wilson about a player who you're not necessarily expecting from the masses outside, right? Those guys that you're not necessarily expecting to pop up. And he says, JoJo Kennerly. He says a wide receiver. When's the last time? You answer this for me. When is the last time that you heard somebody lead the conversation with Morgan State's offense and it was actually positive? This is the first time I've heard it. This is a complete team. And let's not get it twisted. Let's not get it twisted. The defense is still going to be the focus point of that team, the focal point of that team. The defense is still going to be the side of the ball that sets the tone. They're still going to be the reason that they're a championship team, right? I can't talk today. What's going on with me? What's going on with me today? I have always drawn a parallel between Morgan State and Alabama State. And this is so interesting because they've always been two teams who have been defense heavy, but the questions on the offense have kept them from being a championship team. That's been Morgan State. That's been Alabama State. The MEAC and SWAC versions of each other. Last year, when Alabama State got Andrew Body, I said, finally, they have a quarterback. Finally, they'll have offense that can match up with the defense. Whatever happened didn't end up turning out that way. Now you're looking at a year later, Morgan State walks in with so much confidence around their offense. They have a preseason offensive player of the year. They have a quarterback room that one of their players says is the best quarterback room in the conference. And listen, you're supposed to say that. That's your guy. But the fact that he said this off camera and then it was brought onto camera in the interview tells me how much he really believes it, tells me how convicted he is in that belief. And if he's anywhere near close to being right, if they're anywhere near close to being right about Collins being an offensive player of the year candidate, not even having to be a winner, and you return all those starters on defense, all right now. Morgan State might be something to deal with. They might be something to deal with. Now, let's push forward. I'm going to briefly talk about LeSean McCoy. I don't think it needs to be as much of a talking point, but we're going to talk about McCoy because it happened and it was a big deal at MEAC Media Day, and then wrap up with Texas Southern being the team that is flying under the radar in the SWAC. As we're wrapping up today's episode of Locked On HBCU, I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day every day, making it all the way to segment 3. And I thank you 2 times for that. Thank you. LeSean McCoy, I wanted to know what were they going to be, or what was he going to be all about at MEAC Media Day? And he made a huge mistake. One huge mistake that I'm not going to go crazy about because, quite frankly, as someone who has talked about HBCU sports on a religious basis for the last 4 years, I've made the mistake too. I'd like to think that if I was on that stage, I wouldn't have made that mistake, but we've all been there before. I've heard people call North Carolina Central, North Carolina A&T. I've heard people call Howard Hampton and vice versa for both of those. But unfortunately, at MEAC Media Day, in the very opening phrase, LeSean McCoy called Howard Hampton twice. I'm going to tell you why it's a bad look for me. In my opinion, it's a bad look because we know he wanted that job. That's the bad look of everything else. And then you also do it on this stage. It's tough. He was met with a lot of scrutiny, deservedly so. But let me say this. Outside of that mistake, it was a LeSean McCoy type of day. I know that probably sounds crazy, but it was a LeSean McCoy type of day. And I don't know who has paid attention to what he's done in media. Mind you, he's been in media for a good amount of time now. I think a couple of years. I've seen him on I Am Athlete. I've seen him on, he don't have a show anymore, but he was on this show. I've watched his content. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I'm a fan of his, but I've seen enough of the things. They got a LeSean McCoy performance. And it's really a matter of if you like it or you don't. And quite frankly, I don't think that former players are good in that specific place. I don't know if I want former players as my interviewers. I think they're great conversationalists. I think when we're talking long form, they're perfect for that. But as a former player, you have to go into Q&A mode. A lot of times, I don't think it fits the style that they tend to adopt. They tend to adopt charisma. They tend to adopt conversation. They tend to adopt, when done right, analytical approaches, right? Like they really say, I played the game. But this is, and I've seen people complain like journalists versus this. And obviously I'm a journalist. Obviously this is my thing. This is what I came up doing. This is what happens when you put former athletes in these positions. I think that they are great in media. I think they have a perfect place for it. But every now and then, we have to have a reminder that there's a reason that some people were trained to do this job. When it comes to LeSean McCoy, I don't think that was the best usage of his skill set. That's me personally, though. I think that, and I said this before, if you give him a 30-minute interview with Deshaun Jackson and Michael Vick going into the Norfolk State versus Delaware State game, and I think you're going to walk away very impressed with his performance. I think it's going to, not very impressed with his performance, but I think you're going to walk away satisfied with the interview because he's a conversationalist. He talks. I don't think he's a Q&A guy. I don't. But I think that it was LeSean McCoy. You either like it or you don't. But I don't think he did anything wrong outside of the Howard miscue. That's my personal opinion on it. Just like I said, you either like his style or you don't like his style. But you got his style, 100%. I think he can walk away outside of that mistake feeling pretty good about himself because he was himself. And I've watched him. That's exactly what I've seen every other time I've seen him. Anyway, to Texas Southern. They're a team that's flying under the radar, apparently. According per some, do you say according per? I don't know. They're anonymous. I don't know if you can really cite anonymous people, but we talked about the interview that FCS Football Central did with anonymous SWAC coaches and who would win the SWAC. But another question was, which team in the conference isn't getting enough preseason hype? And you've seen multiple answers in here, but the only team that got named more than once was Texas Southern. And they got named 3 times. One person said, I'm interested to see what Texas Southern is going to build. I think Dishman's done a good job, and I'm interested to see what they'll have. Then other people just said Texas Southern twice. That was it. Very simple and plain. My thing about TSU is I'm not ready. I'm ready to see it too, but I'm not ready to crown them as under the radar. And no one said that they think they'll win the SWAC or the SWAC West. No one said that. But I think TSU showed so much promise in that first game of the season. And there's so much stock that's put into that first game of the season when it comes to TSU versus PV. It's interesting because you have a rival and you have it as the first game of the season, and they're in your division. So there's so much at stake when you're talking about the Labor Day Classic, but you also know it's not the end all be all. Like if North Carolina Central and South Carolina State played in the first game of the season, I'm not trying to compare their rivalry, but if they played in the first game of the season, I would literally look at that as a deciding factor. It would be like FAMU versus Jackson State in that 2-year span when they were going at it in the Orange Blossom Classic, and that was the deciding factor in the SWAC. It would have that level of importance. The Labor Day Classic doesn't, because you feel like the loser is going to falter at some, or excuse me, the victor is going to falter at some point, but so is the loser. Like you just feel like that's not the end all be all for your season. But God, I'd be lying if I said it didn't hold so much weight. And though TSU got that monkey off their back, it still holds a lot of weight. It means a lot. So I bring that up to give a caveat, to give kind of a disclaimer that maybe I'm putting too much emphasis on certain things. But at the same time, if you watch that game in 2024, TSU did a lot of things really well. They did a really good job at quarterback, at running back. They had athleticism on the defensive side of the football. It was a really good performance. You obviously have new talent coming in. You obviously have to rearrange the roster and things of that nature. But I, too, am excited to see what they could be because they are building. TSU is one of those teams that's, look, coming from the bottom. TSU is coming from the bottom, and they're just trying to establish themselves as some sort of contender. They're not the team that was in the middle trying to make that jump to the top, so the expectations are lower. But I'm very interested to see what they can build. Because when you're Morgan State and you've been in the middle of the pack for years, we want to see you jump to number one. When you're TSU and you've been at the bottom, we just want to see you jump to the middle of the pack. And now it's like eyes on them because you're ascending. This is going to be a very, very, very interesting team. It's going to be a very interesting conference. I think you could have said the entire SWAC West isn't getting any hype because no one's talking about the West. Maybe it's because they ain't won the conference in years. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe it's because no one knows who's going to be great. But outside of Southern, I don't feel like people are talking about this conference or this division at all. On tomorrow's episode, we're going to move on. We're going to move back to Tennessee State. I know we talked about them Monday, talked about them Tuesday. I took Wednesday off, but now I'm back to the Tigers. I'm back to those other TSU Tigers, if that's what you really want to call them. But Reggie Barlow, he ain't sweating the little preseason polls, but I do want to break down where the Tigers rank and why I'm not sure if it's disrespect or not. In the meantime, in between time, until the next time that we hear each other, family, take care, stay blessed. Peace.